for stopping by Sheila's audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about something horrible happens one night at the Villa Rose in Aix-les-baines. No one knows exactly what. The body of a rich old woman who believes in the spirits and owns a fortune in jewels is strangled to death. The maidservant is chloroformed in her room, and the charming young Mlle Celia, who has learned all the tricks of performing séances, has gone without a trace. And the case involves a gang of hardened criminals. Fortunately, the great detective Monsieur Hanaud is taking on the case. He allows a well-meaning, wealthy, middle-aged English tourist named Mr. Ricardo to tag along on the investigation. Hanaud is as shrewd, observant and devious as the criminals. To all who listened, Mlle Celia's story carried its conviction. Madame Dovry rose vividly before their minds as a living woman. Celia's trickeries were so glibly described that they could hardly have been invented, and certainly not by this poor peasant woman whose lips so bravely struggled with Medici and Montespan, and the names of the other great ladies. How, indeed, should she know of them at all? She could never have had the inspiration to concoct the most convincing item of her story, the queer craze of Madame Dovry for an interview with Madame de Montespan. These details were assuredly the truth. Ricardo, indeed, knew them to be true. Had he not himself seen the girl in her black velvet dress shut up in a cabinet, and a great lady of the past dimly appear in the darkness? Moreover, Mlle Celia's jealousy was so natural and inevitable a thing. Her confession of it corroborated all her story. Well, then, said Hanaud, we come to last night. There was a séance held in the salon last night. No, monsieur, said Celia, shaking her head, there was no séance last night. But already you have said, interrupted the commissaire, and Hanaud held up his hand. Let her speak, my friend. Yes, monsieur shall hear, said Celia. It appeared that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Madame Dovry and Mlle Celia prepared to leave the house on foot. It was their custom to walk down at this hour to the Villa des Fleurs, pass an hour or so there, dine in a restaurant, and return to the rooms to spend the evening. On this occasion, however, Madame Dovry informed Helene that they should be back early and bring with them a friend who was interested in, but entirely skeptical of, spiritualistic manifestations. But we shall convince her tonight, Celia, she said confidently, and the two women then went out. Shortly before 8 Helene closed the shutters both of the upstair and the downstair windows and of the glass doors into the garden, and returned to the kitchen, which was at the back of the house, that is, on the side facing the road. There had been a fall of rain at 7 which had lasted for the greater part of the hour, and soon after she had shut the windows the rain fell again in a heavy shower, and Helene, knowing that Madame felt the chill, lighted a small fire in the salon. The shower lasted until nearly 9, when it ceased altogether and the night cleared up. It was close upon 9:30 when the bell rang from the salon. Celia was sure of the hour, for the charwoman called her attention to the clock. I found Madame Dovry, Mlle Celia, and another woman in the salon, continued Mlle Celia. Madame had let them in with her latchkey. Ah, the other woman, cried Bernard. Had you seen her before? No, monsieur. What was she like? She was sallow, with black hair and bright eyes like beads. She was short and about 45 years old, though it is difficult to judge of these things. I noticed her hands, for she was taking her gloves off, and they seemed to me to be unusually muscular for a woman. Ah! cried Louis Bernard. That is important. Madame Dovry was, as she always was before a séance, in a feverish flutter. You will help Mlle Celia to dress, Helene, and be very quick, she said, and with an extraordinary longing she added, perhaps we shall see her tonight. Her, you understand, was Madame de Montespan. And she turned to the stranger and said, you will believe, Adèle, after tonight. Adèle, said the commissaire wisely. Then Adèle was the strange woman's name? Perhaps, said Hanaud dryly. Mlle Celia reflected. "I think Adele was the name," she said in a more doubtful tone. It sounded like Adele. The irrepressible Mr. Ricardo was impelled to intervene. "What Monsieur Hanaud means," he explained, with the pleasant air of a man happy to illuminate the dark intelligence of a child, "is that Adele was probably a pseudonym." Hanaud turned to him with a savage grin. "Now that is sure to help her," he cried. "A pseudonym. Helene Vauquier is sure to understand that simple and elementary word. How bright this Ricardo is. Where shall we find a new pin more bright? I ask you," and he spread out his hands in a despairing admiration. Mr. Ricardo flushed red, but he answered never a word. He must endure jibes and humiliations like a schoolboy in a class. His one constant fear was lest he should be turned out of the room. The commissaire diverted wrath from him, however. "What he means by pseudonym," he said to Helene Vauquier, explaining Mr. Ricardo to her as Mr. Ricardo had presumed to explain Hanaud, "is a false name. Adele may have been, nay, probably was, a false name adopted by this strange woman." "Adele, I think, was the name used," replied Helene, the doubt in her voice diminishing as she searched her memory. "I am almost sure." "Well, we will call her Adele," said Hanaud impatiently. "What does it matter? Go on, Mademoiselle Vauquier." The lady sat upright and squarely upon the edge of a chair, with a sort of defiance, as though she was determined nothing should convince her, and she laughed incredulously. Here, again, all who heard were able vividly to conjure up the scene, the defiant skeptic sitting squarely on the edge of her chair, removing her gloves from her muscular hands, the excited Madame Dovry, so absorbed in the determination to convince, and Mlle Celia running from the room to put on the black gown which would not be visible in the dim light. "Whilst I took off Mademoiselle's dress," Vauquier continued, "she said, 'When I have gone down to the salon you can go to bed, Helene.' Madame Adele, yes, it was Adele, will be fetched by a friend in a motorcar, and I can let her out and fasten the door again. So if you hear the car you will know that it has come for her." "Oh, she said that?" said Hanaud quickly. "Yes, monsieur." Hanaud looked gloomily towards Wethermill. Then he exchanged a sharp glance with the commissaire, and moved his shoulders in an almost imperceptible shrug. But Mr. Ricardo saw it, and construed it into one word. He imagined a jury uttering the word guilty. Helene Vauquier saw the movement too. "Do not condemn her too quickly, monsieur," she said, with an impulse of remorse. "And not upon my words. For, as I say, I hated her." Hanaud nodded reassuringly, and she resumed. "I was surprised, and I asked Mademoiselle what she would do without her confederate. But she laughed, and said there would be no difficulty. That is partly why I think there was no séance held last night. Monsieur, there was a note in her voice that evening which I did not as yet understand. Mademoiselle then took her bath while I laid out her black dress and the slippers with the soft, noiseless soles. And now I tell you why I am sure there was no séance last night, why Mlle Celia never meant there should be one." "Yes, let us hear that," said Hanaud curiously, and leaning forward with his hands upon his knees. "You have here, monsieur, a description of how Mademoiselle was dressed when she went away." Helene Vauquier picked up a sheet of paper from the table at her side. "I wrote it out at the request of le commissaire." She handed the paper to Hanaud, who glanced through it as she continued. "Well, except for the white lace coat, monsieur, I dressed Mlle Celia just in that way. She would have none of her plain black robe. No, Mlle Celia must wear her fine new evening frock of pale rosetta green chiffon over soft clinging satin, which set off her fair beauty so prettily. It left her white arms and shoulders bare, and it had a long train, and it rustled as she moved. And with that she must put on her pale green silk stockings, her new little satin slippers to match, with the large paste buckles and a sash of green satin looped through another glittering buckle at the side of the waist, with long ends loosely knotted together at the knee. I must tie her fair hair with a silver ribbon, and pin upon her curls a large hat of rosetta green with a golden brown ostrich feather drooping behind. I warned Mademoiselle that there was a tiny fire burning in the salon. Even with the fire screen in front of it there would still be a little light up on the floor, and the glittering buckles on her feet would betray her, even if the rustle of her dress did not. But she said she would kick her slippers off. Ah, gentlemen, it is, after all, not so that one dresses for a séance, she cried, shaking her head. But it is just so, is it not? That one dresses to go to meet a lover. The suggestion startled everyone who heard it. It fairly took Mr. Ricardo's breath away. Wethermill stepped forward with a cry of revolt. The commissaire exclaimed, admiringly, but here is an idea. Even Hanaud sat back in his chair, though his expression lost nothing of its impassivity, and his eyes never moved from Hélène Vauquier's face. Listen, she continued, I will tell you what I think. It was my habit to put out some syrup and lemonade and some little cakes in the dining room, which, as you know, is at the other side of the house across the hall. I think it possible, messieurs, that while Mlle Celia was changing her dress, Madame Dovry and the stranger, Adèle, went into the dining room. I know that Mlle Celia, as soon as she was dressed, ran downstairs to the salon. Well, then, suppose Mlle Celia had a lover waiting with whom she meant to run away. She hurries through the empty salon, opens the glass doors, and is gone, leaving the doors open. And the thief, an accomplice of Adèle, finds the doors open and hides himself in the salon until Madame Dovry returns from the dining room. You see, that leaves Mlle Celia innocent. Vauquier leaned forward eagerly, her white face flushing. There was a moment's silence, and then Hanaud said, That is all very well, Mlle Vauquier. But it does not account for the lace coat in which the girl went away. She must have returned to her room to fetch that after you had gone to bed. Hélène Vauquier leaned back with an air of disappointment. That is true. I had forgotten the coat. I did not like Mlle Celia, but I am not wicked. Nor for the fact that the syrup and the lemonade had not been touched in the dining room, said the commissaire, interrupting her. Again the disappointment overspread Vauquier's face. Is that so? She asked. I did not know, I have been kept a prisoner here. The commissaire cut her short with a cry of satisfaction. Listen. Listen. He exclaimed excitedly. Here is a theory which accounts for all, which combines Vauquier's idea with ours, and Vauquier's idea is, I think, very just, up to a point. Suppose, Hanaud, that the girl was going to meet her lover, but the lover is the murderer. Then all becomes clear. She does not run away to him, she opens the door for him and lets him in. Both Hanaud and Ricardo stole a glance at Wethermill. How did he take the theory? Wethermill was leaning against the wall, his eyes closed, his face white and contorted with a spasm of pain. But he had the air of a man silently enduring an outrage rather than struck down by the conviction that the woman he loved was worthless. It is not for me to say, monsieur, Hélène Vauquier continued. I only tell you what I know. I am a woman, and it would be very difficult for a girl who was eagerly expecting her lover so to act that another woman would not know it. However uncultivated and ignorant the other woman was, that at all events she would know. The knowledge would spread to her of itself, without a word. Consider, gentlemen. And suddenly Hélène Vauquier smiled. A young girl tingling with excitement from head to foot, eager that her beauty just at this moment should be more fresh, more sweet than ever it was, careful that her dress should set it exquisitely off. Imagine it. Her lips ready for the kiss. Oh, how should another woman not know? I saw Mlle Celia, her cheeks rosy, her eyes bright. Never had she looked so lovely. The pale green hat upon her fair head heavy with its curls. From head to foot she looked herself over, and then she sighed with pleasure because she looked so pretty. That was Mlle Celia last night, monsieur. She gathered up her train, took her long white gloves in the other hand, and ran down the stairs, her heels clicking on the wood, her buckles glittering. At the bottom she turned and said to me, Remember, Hélène, you can go to bed. That was it, monsieur. And now violently the rancour of Hélène Vauquier's feelings burst out once more. For her the fine clothes, the pleasure, and the happiness. For me, I could go to bed. Hanaud looked again at the description which Mlle Celia had written out, and read it through carefully. Then he asked a question, of which Ricardo did not quite see the drift. So, he said, when this morning you suggested to Monsieur the Commissaire that it would be advisable for you to go through Mlle Celia's wardrobe, you found that nothing more had been taken away except the white lace coat? That is so. Very well. Now, after Mlle Celia had gone down the stairs, I put the lights out in her room and, as she had ordered me to do, I went to bed. The next thing that I remember, but no, it terrifies me too much to think of it. Helene shuddered and covered her face spasmodically with her hands. Hanaud drew her hands gently down. Courage. You are safe now, mademoiselle. Calm yourself. She lay back with her eyes closed. Yes, it is true. I am safe now. But oh, I feel I shall never dare to sleep again. And the tears swam in her eyes. I woke up with a feeling of being suffocated. Mon Dieu, there was the light burning in the room, and a woman, the strange woman with the strong hands, was holding me down by the shoulders, while a man with his cap drawn over his eyes and a little black moustache pressed over my lips, a pad from which a horribly sweet and sickly taste filled my mouth. Oh, I was terrified. I could not scream. I struggled. The woman told me roughly to keep quiet. But I could not. I must struggle. And then with a brutality unheard of she dragged me up onto my knees while the man kept the pad right over my mouth. The man, with the arm which was free, held me close to him, and she bound my hands with a cord behind me. Look. She held out her wrists. They were terribly bruised. Red and angry lines showed where the cord had cut deeply into her flesh. Then they flung me down again upon my back, and the next thing I remember is the doctor standing over me and this kind nurse supporting me. She sank back exhausted in her chair and wiped her forehead with her handkerchief. The sweat stood upon it in beads. Thank you, mademoiselle, said Hanaud gravely. This has been a trying ordeal for you. I understand that. But we are coming to the end. I want you to read this description of Mlle Celia through again to make sure that nothing is omitted. He gave the paper into the maid's hands. It will be advertised, so it is important that it should be complete. See that you have left out nothing. Mlle Celia bent her head over the paper. No, said Helene at last. I do not think I have omitted anything. And she handed the paper back. I asked you, Hanaud continued suavely, because I understand that Mlle Celia usually wore a pair of diamond eardrops, and they are not mentioned here. A faint color came into the maid's face. That is true, monsieur. I had forgotten. It is quite true. Anyone might forget, said Hanaud, with a reassuring smile. But you will remember now. Think. Did Mlle Celia wear them last night? He leaned forward, waiting for her reply. Whether Mlle too made a movement. Both men evidently thought the point of great importance. The maid looked at Hanaud for a few moments without speaking. It is not from me, mademoiselle, that you will get the answer, said Hanaud quietly. No, monsieur. I was thinking, said the maid, her face flushing at the rebuke. Did she wear them when she went down the stairs last night? He insisted. I think she wore them, she said doubtfully. Yes, and the words came now firm and clear. I remember well. Mlle Celia had taken them off before her bath, and they lay on the dressing table. She put them into her ears while I dressed her hair and arranged the bow of ribbon in it. Then we will add the earrings to your description, said Hanaud, as he rose from his chair with the paper in his hand, and for the moment we need not trouble you any more about Mademoiselle Celia. He folded the paper up, slipped it into his letter case, and put it away in his pocket. Let us consider that poor Madame d'Auvry. Did she keep much money in the house? No, monsieur, very little. She was well known in Aix and her checks were everywhere accepted without question. It was a high pleasure to serve Madame, her credit was so good, said Mlle Celia, raising her head as though she herself had a share in the pride of that good credit. No doubt, Hanaud agreed. There are many fine households where the banking account is overdrawn, and it cannot be pleasant for the servants. They are put to so many shifts to hide it from the servants of their neighbors, said Helene. Besides, and she made a little grimace of contempt, a fine household and an overdrawn banking account, it is like a ragged petticoat under a satin dress. That was never the case with Madame d'Auvry. So that she was under no necessity to have ready money always in her pocket, said Hanaud. I understand that. But at times perhaps she won at the Villa des Fleurs. Helene Vauquier shook her head. She loved the Villa des Fleurs, but she never played for high sums and often never played at all. If she won a few louis, she was as delighted with her gains and as afraid to lose them again at the tables as if she were of the poorest, and she stopped at once. No, monsieur, 20 or 30 louis, there was never more than that in the house. Then it was certainly for her famous collection of jewelry that Madame d'Auvry was murdered? Certainly, monsieur. Now, where did she keep her jewelry? In a safe in her bedroom, monsieur. Every night she took off what she had been wearing and locked it up with the rest. She was never too tired for that. And what did she do with the keys? That I cannot tell you. Certainly she locked her rings and necklaces away whilst I undressed her. And she laid the keys upon the dressing table or the mantel shelf, anywhere. But in the morning the keys were no longer where she had left them. She had put them secretly away. Hanaud turned to another point. I suppose that Mlle Celia knew of the safe and that the jewels were kept there. Oh yes. Mademoiselle indeed was often in Madame d'Auvry's room when she was dressing or undressing. She must often have seen Madame take them out and lock them up again. But then, monsieur, so did I. Hanaud nodded to her with a friendly smile. Thank you once more, mademoiselle, he said. The torture is over. But of course Monsieur Fleuriot will require your presence. Helene Vauquier looked anxiously towards him. But meanwhile I can go from this villa, monsieur, she pleaded, with a trembling voice. Certainly, you shall go to your friends at once. Oh, monsieur, thank you, she cried, and suddenly she gave way. The tears began to flow from her eyes. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. It is foolish of me, but what would you? She jerked out the words between her sobs. It has been too terrible. Yes, yes, said Hanaud soothingly. The nurse will put a few things together for you in a bag. You will not leave Aix, of course, and I will send someone with you to your friends. The maid started violently. Oh, not a sergeant de ville, monsieur, I beg of you. I should be disgraced. No. It shall be a man in plain clothes, to see that you are not hindered by reporters on the way. Hanaud turned towards the door. On the dressing table a cord was lying. He took it up and spoke to the nurse. Was this the cord with which Helene Vauquier's hands were tied? Yes, monsieur, she replied. Hanaud handed it to the commissaire. It will be necessary to keep that, he said. It was a thin piece of strong whipcord. It was the same kind of cord as that which had been found tied round Madame d'Auvry's throat. Hanaud opened the door and turned back to the nurse. We will send for a cab for Mlle Vauquier. You will drive with her to her door. I think after that she will need no further help. Pack up a few things and bring them down. Mlle Vauquier can follow, no doubt, now without assistance. And, with a friendly nod, he left the room. Ricardo had been wondering, through the examination, in what light Hanaud considered Helene Vauquier. He was sympathetic, but the sympathy might merely have been assumed to deceive. His questions betrayed in no particular the color of his mind. Now, however, he made himself clear. He informed the nurse, in the plainest possible way, that she was no longer to act as jailer. She was to bring Vauquier's things down, but Vauquier could follow by herself. Evidently Helene Vauquier was cleared. Chapter 7: A startling discovery. Harry Wethermill, however, was not so easily satisfied. Surely, monsieur, it would be well to know whither she is going, he said, and to make sure that when she has gone there she will stay there until we want her again? Hanaud looked at the young man pityingly. I can understand, monsieur, that you hold strong views about Helene Vauquier. You are human, like the rest of us. And what she has said to us just now would not make you more friendly. But, and he preferred to shrug his shoulders rather than to finish in words his sentence. However, he said, we shall take care to know where Helene Vauquier is staying. Indeed, if she is at all implicated in this affair we shall learn more if we leave her free than if we keep her under lock and key. You see that if we leave her quite free, but watch her very, very carefully, so as to awaken no suspicion, she may be emboldened to do something rash, or the others may. Mr. Ricardo approved of Hanaud's reasoning. That is quite true, he said. She might write a letter. Yes, or receive one, added Hanaud, which would be still more satisfactory for us supposing, of course, that she has anything to do with this affair, and again he shrugged his shoulders. He turned towards the commissaire. You have a discreet officer whom you can trust? He asked. Certainly, a dozen. I want only one. And here he is, said the commissaire. They were descending the stairs. On the landing of the first floor Dorette, the man who had discovered where the cord was bought, was still waiting. Hanaud took Dorette by the sleeve in the familiar way which he so commonly used and led him to the top of the stairs, where the two men stood for a few moments apart. It was plain that Hanaud was giving, Dorette receiving, definite instructions. Dorette descended the stairs, Hanaud came back to the others. I have told him to fetch a cab, he said, and convey Helene Vauquier to her friends. Then he looked at Ricardo, and from Ricardo to the commissaire, while he rubbed his hand backwards and forwards across his shaven chin. I tell you, he said, I find this sinister little drama very interesting to me. The sordid, miserable struggle for mastery in this household of Madame d'Auvry, eh? Yes, very interesting. Just as much patience, just as much effort, just as much planning for this small end as a general uses to defeat an army and, at the last, nothing gained. What else is politics? Yes, very interesting. His eyes rested upon Wethermill's face for a moment, but they gave the young man no hope. He took a key from his pocket. We need not keep this room locked, he said. We know all that there is to be known. And he inserted the key into the lock of Celia's room and turned it. But is that wise, monsieur? Said Bernard. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. Why not? He asked. The case is in your hands, said the commissaire. To Ricardo the proceedings seemed singularly irregular. But if the commissaire was content, it was not for him to object. And where is my excellent friend Perrichet? Asked Hanaud, and leaning over the balustrade he called him up from the hall. We will now, said Hanaud, have a glance into this poor murdered woman's room. The room was opposite to Celia's. Bernard produced the key and unlocked the door. Hanaud took off his hat upon the threshold and then passed into the room with his companions. Upon the bed, outlined under a sheet, lay the rigid form of Madame d'Auvry. Hanaud stepped gently to the bedside and reverently uncovered the face. For a moment all could see it livid, swollen, unhuman. A brutal business, he said in a low voice, and when he turned again to his companions his face was white and sickly. He replaced the sheet and gazed about the room. It was decorated and furnished in the same style as the salon downstairs, yet the contrast between the two rooms was remarkable. Downstairs, in the salon, only a chair had been overturned. Here there was every sign of violence and disorder. An empty safe stood open in one corner, the rugs upon the polished floor had been tossed aside, every drawer had been torn open, every wardrobe burst, the very bed had been moved from its position. It was in this safe that Madame d'Auvry hid her jewels each night, said the commissaire as Hanaud gazed about the room. Oh, was it so? Hanaud asked slowly. It seemed to Ricardo that he read something in the aspect of this room too, which troubled his mind and increased his perplexity. Yes, said Bernard confidently. Every night Madame d'Auvry locked her jewels away in this safe. Vauquier told us so this morning. Every night she was never too tired for that. Besides, here, and putting his hand into the safe, he drew out a paper. Here is the list of Madame Dovery's jewelry. Plainly, however, Hanaud was not satisfied. He took the list and glanced through the items. But his thoughts were not concerned with it. If that is so, he said slowly, Madame Dovery kept her jewels in this safe. Why has every drawer been ransacked? Why was the bed moved? Perrichet, lock the door quietly from the inside. That is right. Now lean your back against it. Hanaud waited until he saw Perrichet's broad back against the door. Then he went down upon his knees, and, tossing the rugs here and there, examined with the minutest care the inlaid floor. By the side of the bed a Persian mat of blue silk was spread. This in its turn he moved quickly aside. He bent his eyes to the ground, lay prone, moved this way and that to catch the light upon the floor, then with a spring he rose upon his knees. He lifted his finger to his lips. In a dead silence he drew a penknife quickly from his pocket and opened it. He bent down again and inserted the blade between the cracks of the blocks. The three men in the room watched him with an intense excitement. A block of wood rose from the floor. He pulled it out, laid it noiselessly down, and inserted his hand into the opening. Wethermill at Ricardo's elbow uttered a stifled cry. "Hush!" whispered Hanaud angrily. He drew out his hand again. It was holding a green leather jewel case. He opened it, and a diamond necklace flashed its 1,000 colors in their faces. He thrust in his hand again and again and again, and each time that he withdrew it, it held a jewel case. Before the astonished eyes of his companions he opened them. Ropes of pearls, collars of diamonds, necklaces of emeralds, rings of pigeon blood rubies, bracelets of gold studded with opals. Madame Dovery's various jewelry was disclosed. "But that is astounding," said Bernard, in an awestruck voice. "Then she was never robbed after all?" cried Ricardo. Hanaud rose to his feet. "What a piece of irony!" he whispered. "The poor woman is murdered for her jewels, the rooms turned upside down, and nothing is found. For all the while they lay safe in this cache. Nothing is taken except what she wore. Let us see what she wore." "Only a few rings," Helene Vauquier thought, said Bernard. But she was not sure. "Ah," said Hanaud. "Well, let us make sure." And, taking the list from the safe, he compared it with the jewelry in the cases on the floor, ticking off the items one by one. When he had finished he knelt down again, and, thrusting his hand into the hole, felt carefully about. "There is a pearl necklace missing," he said. "A valuable necklace, from the description in the list, and some rings. She must have been wearing them," and he sat back upon his heels. "We will send the intelligent Perrichet for a bag," he said, "and we will counsel the intelligent Perrichet not to breathe a word to any living soul of what he has seen in this room. Then we will seal up in the bag the jewels, and we will hand it over to Le Commissaire, who will convey it with the greatest secrecy out of this villa. For the list, I will keep it," and he placed it carefully in his pocketbook. He unlocked the door and went out himself onto the landing. He looked down the stairs and up the stairs, then he beckoned Perrichet to him. "Go," he whispered. "Be quick, and when you come back hide the bag carefully under your coat." Perrichet went down the stairs with pride written upon his face. Was he not assisting the great Hanaud from the Sûreté in Paris? Hanaud returned into Madame Dovery's room and closed the door. He looked into the eyes of his companions. "Can't you see the scene?" he asked with a queer smile of excitement. He had forgotten Wethermill, he had forgotten even the dead woman shrouded beneath the sheet. He was absorbed. His eyes were bright, his whole face vivid with life. Ricardo saw the real man at this moment and feared for the happiness of Harry Wethermill. For nothing would Hanaud now turn aside until he had reached the truth and set his hands upon the quarry. Of that Ricardo felt sure. He was trying now to make his companions visualize just what he saw and understood. "Can't you see it? The old woman locking up her jewels in this safe every night before the eyes of her maid or her companion, and then, as soon as she was alone, taking them stealthily out of the safe and hiding them in this secret place. But I tell you this is human. Yes, It is interesting just because it is so human. Then picture to yourselves last night, the murderers opening this safe and finding nothing, but nothing. And ransacking the room in deadly haste, kicking up the rugs, forcing open the drawers, and always finding nothing. Think of their rage, their stupefaction, and finally their fear. They must go, and with one pearl necklace, when they had hoped to reap a great fortune. Oh, but this is interesting, yes, I tell you, I, who have seen many strange things, this is interesting. Perrichet returned with a canvas bag, into which Hanaud placed the jewel cases. He sealed the bag in the presence of the 4 men and handed it to Bernard. He replaced the block of wood in the floor, covered it over again with the rug, and rose to his feet. "Listen," he said, in a low voice, and with a gravity which impressed them all. "There is something in this house which I do not understand. I have told you so. I tell you something more now. I am afraid. And the word startled his hearers like a thunderclap, though it was breathed no louder than a whisper. "Yes, my friends," he repeated, nodding his head, terribly afraid. And upon the others fell a discomfort, an awe, as though something sinister and dangerous were present in the room and close to them. So vivid was the feeling, instinctively they drew nearer together. "Now, I warn you solemnly. There must be no whisper that these jewels have been discovered, no newspaper must publish a hint of it, no one must suspect that here in this room we have found them. Is that understood?" "Certainly," said the commissaire. "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo. "To be sure, monsieur," said Perrichet. As for Harry Wethermill, he made no reply. His burning eyes were fixed upon Hanaud's face, and that was all. Hanaud, for his part, asked for no reply from him. Indeed, he did not look towards Harry Wethermill's face at all. Ricardo understood. Hanaud did not mean to be deterred by the suffering written there. He went down again into the little gay salon lit with flowers and August sunlight, and stood beside the couch gazing at it with troubled eyes. And, as he gazed, he closed his eyes and shivered. He shivered like a man who has taken a sudden chill. Nothing in all this morning's investigations, not even the rigid body beneath the sheet, nor the strange discovery of the jewels, had so impressed Ricardo. For there he had been confronted with facts, definite and complete. Here was a suggestion of unknown horrors, a hint, not a fact, compelling the imagination to dark conjecture. Hanaud shivered. That he had no idea why Hanaud shivered made the action still more significant, still more alarming. And it was not Ricardo alone who was moved by it. A voice of despair rang through the room. The voice was Harry Wethermill's, and his face was ashy white. "Monsieur," he cried, "I do not know what makes you shudder, but I am remembering a few words you used this morning." Hanaud turned upon his heel. His face was drawn and grey and his eyes blazed. "My friend, I also am remembering those words," he said. Thus the 2 men stood confronting one another, eye to eye, with awe and fear in both their faces. Ricardo was wondering to what words they both referred, when the sound of wheels broke in upon the silence. The effect upon Hanaud was magical. He thrust his hands in his pockets. "Helene Vauquier's cab," he said lightly. He drew out his cigarette case and lighted a cigarette. "Let us see that poor woman safely off. It is a closed cab, I hope." It was a closed landau. It drove past the open door of the salon to the front door of the house. In Hanaud's wake they all went out into the hall. The nurse came down alone carrying Helene Vauquier's bag. She placed it in the cab and waited in the doorway. "Perhaps Helene Vauquier has fainted," she said anxiously. "She does not come." And she moved towards the stairs. Hanaud took a singularly swift step forward and stopped her. "Why should you think that?" he asked, with a queer smile upon his face, and as he spoke a door closed gently upstairs. "See," he continued, "you are wrong, she is coming." Ricardo was puzzled. It had seemed to him that the door which had closed so gently was nearer than Helene Vauquier's door. It seemed to him that the door was upon the first, not the second landing. But Hanaud had noticed nothing strange, so it could not be. He greeted Helene Vauquier with a smile as she came down the stairs. You are better, mademoiselle, he said politely. One can see that. There is more color in your cheeks. A day or two, and you will be yourself again. He held the door open while she got into the cab. The nurse took her seat beside her, Dorette mounted on the box. The cab turned and went down the drive. Goodbye, mademoiselle, cried Hanaud, and he watched until the high shrubs hid the cab from his eyes. Then he behaved in an extraordinary way. He turned and sprang like lightning up the stairs. His agility amazed Ricardo. The others followed upon his heels. He flung himself at Celia's door and opened it. He burst into the room, stood for a second, then ran to the window. He hid behind the curtain, looking out. With his hand he waved to his companions to keep back. The sound of wheels creaking and rasping rose to their ears. The cab had just come out into the road. Dorette upon the box turned and looked towards the house. Just for a moment Hanaud leaned from the window, as Bernard, the commissaire, had done, and, like Bernard again, he waved his hand. Then he came back into the room and saw, standing in front of him, with his mouth open and his eyes starting out of his head, Perrichet, the intelligent Perrichet. Monsieur, cried Perrichet, something has been taken from this room. Hanaud looked round the room and shook his head. No, he said. But yes, monsieur, Perrichet insisted. Oh, but yes. See. Upon this dressing table there was a small pot of cold cream. It stood here, where my finger is, when we were in this room an hour ago. Now it is gone. Hanaud burst into a laugh. My friend Perrichet, he said ironically, I will tell you the newspaper did not do you justice. You are more intelligent. The truth, my excellent friend, lies at the bottom of a well, but you would find it at the bottom of a pot of cold cream. Now let us go. For in this house, gentlemen, we have nothing more to do. He passed out of the room. Perrichet stood aside, his face crimson, his attitude one of shame. He had been rebuked by the great M. Hanaud, and justly rebuked. He knew it now. He had wished to display his intelligence, yes, at all costs he must show how intelligent he was. And he had shown himself a fool. He should have kept silence about that pot of cream. Chapter 8. The Captain of the Ship. Hanaud walked away from the Villa Rose in the company of Wethermill and Ricardo. We will go and lunch, he said. Yes, come to my hotel, said Harry Wethermill. But Hanaud shook his head. No, come with me to the Villa des Fleurs, he replied. We may learn something there, and in a case like this every minute is of importance. We have to be quick. I may come too? Cried Mr. Ricardo eagerly. By all means, replied Hanaud, with a smile of extreme courtesy. Nothing could be more delicious than Monsieur's suggestions, and with that remark he walked on silently. Mr. Ricardo was in a little doubt as to the exact significance of the words. But he was too excited to dwell long upon them. Distressed though he sought to be at his friend's grief, he could not but assume an air of importance. All the artist in him rose joyfully to the occasion. He looked upon himself from the outside. He fancied without the slightest justification that people were pointing him out. That man has been present at the investigation at the Villa Rose, he seemed to hear people say. What strange things he could tell us if he would. And suddenly, Mr. Ricardo began to reflect. What, after all, could he have told them? And that question he turned over in his mind while he ate his luncheon. Hanaud wrote a letter between the courses. They were sitting at a corner table, and Hanaud was in the corner with his back to the wall. He moved his plate, too, over the letter as he wrote it. It would have been impossible for either of his guests to see what he had written, even if they had wished. Ricardo, indeed, did wish. He rather resented the secrecy with which the detective, under a show of openness, shrouded his thoughts and acts. Hanaud sent the waiter out to fetch an officer in plain clothes, who was in attendance at the door, and he handed the letter to this man. Then he turned with an apology to his guests. It is necessary that we should find out, he explained, as soon as possible, the whole record of Mlle Celia. He lighted a cigar, and over the coffee he put a question to Ricardo. Now tell me what you make of the case. What Wethermill thinks, that is clear, is it not? Helene Vauquier is the guilty one. But you, Ricardo. What is your opinion? Ricardo took from his pocketbook a sheet of paper and from his pocket a pencil. He was intensely flattered by the request of Hanaud, and he proposed to do himself justice. I will make a note here of what I think the salient features of the mystery, and he proceeded to tabulate the points in the following way. 1. Celia Harland made her entrance into Madame Dovery's household under very doubtful circumstances. 2. By methods still more doubtful she acquired an extraordinary ascendancy over Madame Dovery's mind. 3. If proof were needed how complete that ascendancy was, a glance at Celia Harland's wardrobe would suffice, for she wore the most expensive clothes. 4. It was Celia Harland who arranged that Servatas, the chauffeur, should be absent at Chambéry on the Tuesday night, the night of the murder. 5. It was Celia Harland who bought the cord with which Madame Dovery was strangled and Helene Vauquier bound. 6. The footsteps outside the salon show that Celia Harland ran from the salon to the motorcar. 7. Celia Harland pretended that there should be a séance on the Tuesday, but she dressed as though she had in view an appointment with a lover, instead of a spiritualistic stance. 8. Celia Harland has disappeared. These 8 points are strongly suggestive of Celia Harland's complicity in the murder. But I have no clue which will enable me to answer the following questions. A. Who was the man who took part in the crime? B. Who was the woman who came to the villa on the evening of the murder with Madame Dovery and Celia Harland? C. What actually happened in the salon? How was the murder committed? D. Is Helene Vauquier's story true? E. What did the torn-up scrap of writing mean? Probably spirit writing in Celia Harland's hand. F. Why has one cushion on the settee a small, fresh, brown stain, which is probably blood? Why is the other cushion torn? Mr. Ricardo had a momentary thought of putting down yet another question. He was inclined to ask whether or no a pot of cold cream had disappeared from Celia Harland's bedroom, but he remembered that Hanaud had set no store upon that incident, and he refrained. Moreover, he had come to the end of his sheet of paper. He handed it across the table to Hanaud and leaned back in his chair, watching the detective with all the eagerness of a young author submitting his first effort to a critic. Hanaud read it through slowly. At the end he nodded his head in approval. Now we will see what Wethermill has to say, he said, and he stretched out the paper towards Harry Wethermill, who throughout the luncheon had not said a word. No, no, cried Ricardo, but Harry Wethermill already held the written sheet in his hand. He smiled rather wistfully at his friend. It is best that I should know just what you both think, he said, and in his turn he began to read the paper through. He read the first 8 points, and then beat with his fist upon the table. No, no, he cried, it is not possible. I don't blame you, Ricardo. These are facts, and, as I said, I can face facts. But there will be an explanation, if only we can discover it. He buried his face for a moment in his hands. Then he took up the paper again. As for the rest, Helene Vauquier lied, he cried violently, and he tossed the paper to Hanaud. What do you make of it? Hanaud smiled and shook his head. Did you ever go for a voyage on a ship? He asked. Yes, why? Because every day at noon 3 officers take an observation to determine the ship's position: the captain, the first officer, and the second officer. Each writes his observation down, and the captain takes the 3 observations and compares them. If the first or second officer is out in his reckoning, the captain tells him so, but he does not show his own. For at times, no doubt, he is wrong too. So, gentlemen, I criticize your observations, but I do not show you mine. He took up Ricardo's paper and read it through again. Yes, he said pleasantly. But the 2 questions which are most important, which alone can lead us to the truth. How do they come to be omitted from your list, Mr. Ricardo? Hanaud put the question with his most serious air. But Ricardo was none the less sensible of the raillery behind the solemn manner. He flushed and made no answer. Still, Continued Hanaud, here are undoubtedly some questions. Let us consider them. Who was the man who took a part in the crime? Ah, if we only knew that, what a lot of trouble we should save ourselves. Who was the woman? What a good thing it would be to know that too. How clearly, after all, Mr. Ricardo puts his finger on the important points. What did actually happen in the salon? And as he quoted the question, the raillery died out of his voice. He leaned his elbows on the table and bent forward. What did actually happen in that little pretty room, just 12 hours ago? He repeated. When no sunlight blazed upon the lawn and all the birds were still, and all the windows shuttered and the world dark, what happened? What dreadful things happened? We have not much to go upon. Let us formulate what we know. We start with this. The murder was not the work of a moment. It was planned with great care and cunning, and carried out to the letter of the plan. There must be no noise, no violence. On each side of the villa rows there are other villas, a few yards away the road runs past, a scream, a cry, the noise of a struggle, these sounds, or any one of them, might be fatal to success. Thus the crime was planned, and there was no scream, there was no struggle. Not a chair was broken, and only a chair upset. Yes, there were brains behind that murder. We know that. But what do we know of the plan? How far can we build it up? Let us see. First, there was an accomplice in the house, perhaps two. No, cried Harry Wethermill. Hanaud took no notice of the interruption. Secondly, the woman came to the house with Madame Dovry and Mlle Celia between 9 and 9:30. Thirdly, the man came afterwards, but before 11, set open the gate, and was admitted into the salon, unperceived by Madame Dovry. That also we can safely assume. But what happened in the salon? Ah, there is the question. Then he shrugged his shoulders and said with the note of raillery once more in his voice. But why should we trouble our heads to puzzle out this mystery, since Ricardo knows? I? Cried Ricardo in amazement. To be sure, replied Hanaud calmly. For I look at another of your questions. What did the torn-up scrap of writing mean? And you add, probably spirit writing. Then there was a séance held last night in the little salon. Is that so? Harry Wethermill started. Mr. Ricardo was at a loss. I had not followed my suggestion to its conclusion, he admitted humbly. No, said Hanaud. But I ask myself in sober earnest, was there a séance held in the salon last night? Did the tambourine rattle in the darkness on the wall? But if Helene Vauquier's story is all untrue, cried Wethermill, again in exasperation. Patience, my friend. Her story was not all untrue. I say there were brains behind this crime, yes, but brains, even the cleverest, would not have invented this queer, strange story of the séances and of Madame de Montespan. That is truth. But yet, if there were a séance held, if the scrap of paper was spirit writing in answer to some awkward question, why, and here I come to my first question, which Ricardo has omitted, why did Mlle Celia dress herself with so much elegance last night? What Vauquier said is true. Her dress was not suited to a séance. A light-colored, rustling frock, which would be visible in a dim light, or even in the dark, which would certainly be heard at every movement she made, however lightly she stepped, and a big hat. No. I tell you, gentlemen, we shall not get to the bottom of this mystery until we know why Mlle Celia dressed herself as she did last night. Yes, Ricardo admitted. I overlooked that point. Did she? Hanaud broke off and bowed to Wethermill with a grace and a respect which condoned his words. You must bear with me, my young friend, while I consider all these points. Did she expect to join that night a lover, a man with the brains to devise this crime? But if so, and here I come to the second question omitted from Ricardo's list, why, on the patch of grass outside the door of the salon, were the footsteps of the man and woman so carefully erased, and the footsteps of Mlle Celia, those little footsteps so easily identified, left for all the world to see and recognize? Ricardo felt like a child in the presence of his schoolmaster. He was convicted of presumption. He had set down his questions with the belief that they covered the ground. And here were two of the utmost importance, not forgotten, but never even thought of. Did she go, before the murder, to join a lover? Or after it? At some time, you will remember, according to Vauquier's story, she must have run upstairs to fetch her coat. Was the murder committed during the interval when she was upstairs? Was the salon dark when she came down again? Did she run through it quickly, eagerly, noticing nothing amiss? And, indeed, how should she notice anything if the salon were dark, and Madame Dovery's body lay under the windows at the side? Ricardo leaned forward eagerly. That must be the truth, he cried, and Wethermill's voice broke hastily in. It is not the truth, and I will tell you why. Celia Harland was to have married me this week. There was so much pain and misery in his voice that Ricardo was moved as he had seldom been. Wethermill buried his face in his hands. Hanaud shook his head and gazed across the table at Ricardo with an expression which the latter was at no loss to understand. Lovers were impracticable people. But he, Hanaud, he knew the world. Women had fooled men before today. Wethermill snatched his hands away from before his face. We talk theories, he cried desperately, of what may have happened at the villa. But we are not by 1 inch nearer to the man and woman who committed the crime. It is for them we have to search. Yes, but except by asking ourselves questions, how shall we find them, M. Wethermill? Said Hanaud. Take the man. We know nothing of him. He has left no trace. Look at this town of Aix, where people come and go like a crowd about the baccarat table. He may be at Marseille today. He may be in this very room where we are taking our luncheon. How shall we find him? Wethermill nodded his head in a despairing assent. I know. But it is so hard to sit still and do nothing, he cried. Yes, but we are not sitting still, said Hanaud, and Wethermill looked up with a sudden interest. All the time that we have been lunching here the intelligent Perrichet has been making inquiries. Madame Dovry and Mlle Celia left the Villa Rose at 5, and returned on foot soon after 9 with a strange woman. And there I see Perrichet himself waiting to be summoned. Hanaud beckoned towards the Sergeant de Ville. Perrichet will make an excellent detective, he said, for he looks more bovine and foolish in plain clothes than he does in uniform. Perrichet advanced in his mufti to the table. Speak, my friend, said Hanaud. I went to the shop of M. Corval. Mlle Celia was quite alone when she bought the cord. But a few minutes later, in the Rue du Casino, she and Madame Dovry were seen together, walking slowly in the direction of the villa. No other woman was with them. That is a pity, said Hanaud quietly, and with a gesture he dismissed Perrichet. You see, we shall find out nothing, said Wethermill with a groan. We must not yet lose heart, for we know a little more about the woman than we do about the man, said Hanaud consolingly. True, exclaimed Ricardo. We have Helene Vauquier's description of her. We must advertise it. Hanaud smiled. But that is a fine suggestion, he cried. We must think over that, and he clapped his hand to his forehead with a gesture of self-reproach. Why did not such a fine idea occur to me, fool that I am? However, we will call the head waiter. The head waiter was sent for and appeared before them. You knew Madame Dovry? Hanaud asked. Yes, Monsieur O, the poor woman. And he flung up his hands. And you knew her young companion? Oh yes, monsieur. They generally had their meals here. See, at that little table over there. I kept it for them. But monsieur knows well, and the waiter looked towards Harry Wethermill, for monsieur was often with them. Yes, said Hanaud. Did Madame Dovry dine at that little table last night? No, monsieur. She was not here last night. Nor Mlle Celia? No, monsieur. I do not think they were in the Villa des Fleurs at all. We know they were not, exclaimed Ricardo. Wethermill and I were in the rooms and we did not see them. But perhaps you left early, objected Hanaud. No, said Ricardo. It was just 10 o'clock when we reached the Majestic. You reached your hotel at 10, Hanaud repeated. Did you walk straight from here? Yes. Then you left here about 9:15. And we know that Madame Dovry was back at the villa soon after 9. Yes, they could not have been here last night, Hanaud agreed, and sat for a moment silent. Then he turned to the head waiter. Have you noticed any woman with Madame Dovry and her companion lately? No, monsieur. I do not think so. Think. A woman, for instance, with red hair. Harry Wethermill started forward. Mr. Ricardo stared at Hanaud in amazement. The waiter reflected. No, monsieur. I have seen no woman with red hair. Thank you, said Hanaud, and the waiter moved away. A woman with red hair, cried Wethermill. But Helene Vauquier described her. She was sallow, her eyes, her hair, were dark. Hanaud turned with a smile to Harry Wethermill. Did Helene Vauquier, then, speak the truth? He asked. No, the woman who was in the salon last night, who returned home with Madame Dovry and Mlle Celia, was not a woman with black hair and bright black eyes. Look. And, fetching his pocketbook from his pocket, he unfolded a sheet of paper and showed them, lying upon its white surface a long red hair. I picked that up on the table, the round satinwood table in the salon. It was easy not to see it, but I did see it. Now, that is not Mlle Celia's hair, which is fair, nor Madame Dovry's, which is dyed brown, nor Helene Vauquier's, which is black, nor the charwoman's, which, as I have taken the trouble to find out, is grey. It is therefore from the head of our unknown woman. And I will tell you more. This woman with the red hair, she is in Geneva. A startled exclamation burst from Ricardo. Harry Wethermill sat slowly down. For the first time that day there had come some colour into his cheeks, a sparkle into his eye. But that is wonderful, he cried. How did you find that out? Hanaud leaned back in his chair and took a pull at his cigar. He was obviously pleased with Wethermill's admiration. Yes, how did you find it out? Ricardo repeated. Hanaud smiled. As to that, he said, remember I am the captain of the ship, and I do not show you my observation. Ricardo was disappointed. Harry Wethermill, however, started to his feet. We must search Geneva, then, he cried. It is there that we should be, not here drinking our coffee at the Villa des Fleurs. Hanaud raised his hand. The search is not being overlooked. But Geneva is a big city. It is not easy to search Geneva and find, when we know nothing about the woman for whom we are searching, except that her hair is red, and that probably a young girl last night was with her. It is rather here, I think, in Aix, that we must keep our eyes wide open. Here! Cried Wethermill in exasperation. He stared at Hanaud as though he were mad. Yes, here, at the post office, at the telephone exchange. Suppose that the man is in Aix, as he may well be, some time he will wish to send a letter, or a telegram, or a message over the telephone. That, I tell you, is our chance. But here is news for us. Hanaud pointed to a messenger who was walking towards them. The man handed Hanaud an envelope. From Le Commissaire, he said, and he saluted and retired. From Le Commissaire? Cried Ricardo excitedly, but before Hanaud could open the envelope, Harry Wethermill laid a hand upon his sleeve. Before we pass to something new, Hanaud, he said, I should be very glad if you would tell me what made you shiver in the salon this morning. It has distressed me ever since. What was it that those two cushions had to tell you? There was a note of anguish in his voice difficult to resist. But Hanaud resisted it. He shook his head. Again, he said gravely, I am to remind you that I am captain of the ship and do not show my observation. He tore open the envelope and sprang up from his seat. Madame Dovry's motorcar has been found, he cried. Let us go. Hanaud called for the bill and paid it. The three men left the Villa des Fleurs together. Chapter 9. Madame Dovery's motor car. They got into a cab outside the door. Perrichet mounted the box, and the cab was driven along the upward winding road past the Hotel Bernascon. 100 yards beyond the hotel the cab stopped opposite to a villa. A hedge separated the garden of the villa from the road, and above the hedge rose a board with the words "To Let" upon it. At the gate a gendarme was standing, and just within the gate Ricardo saw Louis Bernard, the commissaire, and Servatas, Madame Dovery's chauffeur. "It is here," said Bernard, as the party descended from the cab, "in the coach-house of this empty villa." "Here?" cried Ricardo in amazement. The discovery upset all his theories. He had expected to hear that it had been found 50 leagues away, but here, within a couple of miles of the Villa Rose itself, the idea seemed absurd. Why take it away at all unless it was taken away as a blind? That supposition found its way into Ricardo's mind, and gathered strength as he thought upon it, for Hanaud had seemed to lean to the belief that one of the murderers might be still in Aix. Indeed, a glance at him showed that he was not discomposed by their discovery. "When was it found?" Hanaud asked. "This morning. A gardener comes to the villa on 2 days a week to keep the grounds in order. Fortunately Wednesday is one of his days. Fortunately, too, there was rain yesterday evening. He noticed the tracks of the wheels which you can see on the gravel, and since the villa is empty he was surprised. He found the coach-house door forced and the motor car inside it. When he went to his luncheon he brought the news of his discovery to the depot. The party followed the commissaire along the drive to the coach-house. "We will have the car brought out," said Hanaud to Servatas. It was a big and powerful machine with a limousine body, luxuriously fitted and cushioned in the shade of light grey. The outside panels of the car were painted a dark grey. The car had hardly been brought out into the sunlight before a cry of stupefaction burst from the lips of Perrichet. "Oh!" he cried, in utter abasement. "I shall never forgive myself, never, never." "Why?" Hanaud asked, turning sharply as he spoke. Perrichet was standing with his round eyes staring and his mouth agape. "Because, monsieur, I saw that car, at 4 o'clock this morning, at the corner of the road not 50 yards from the Villa Rose." "What?" cried Ricardo. "You saw it?" exclaimed Wethermill. Upon their faces was reflected now the stupefaction of Perrichet. "But you must have made a mistake," said the commissaire. "No, no, monsieur," Perrichet insisted. "It was that car. It was that number. It was just after daylight. I was standing outside the gate of the villa on duty where Le Commissaire had placed me. The car appeared at the corner and slackened speed. It seemed to me that it was going to turn into the road and come down past me. But instead the driver, as if he were now sure of his way, put the car at its top speed and went on into Aix." "Was anyone inside the car?" asked Hanaud. "No, monsieur, it was empty." "But you saw the driver?" exclaimed Wethermill. "Yes, what was he like?" cried the commissaire. Perrichet shook his head mournfully. He wore a talc mask over the upper part of his face, and had a little black moustache, and was dressed in a heavy greatcoat of blue with a white collar. "That is my coat, monsieur," said Servatas, and as he spoke he lifted it up from the chauffeur's seat. "It is Madame Dovery's livery." Harry Wethermill groaned aloud. "We have lost him. He was within our grasp, he, the murderer, and he was allowed to go." Perrichet's grief was pitiable. "Monsieur," he pleaded, "a car slackens its speed and goes on again. It is not so unusual a thing. I did not know the number of Madame Dovery's car. I did not even know that it had disappeared," and suddenly tears of mortification filled his eyes. "But why do I make these excuses?" he cried. "It is better, Hanaud, that I go back to my uniform and stand at the street corner. I am as foolish as I look." "Nonsense, my friend," said Hanaud, clapping the disconsolate man upon the shoulder. "You remembered the car and its number. That is something and perhaps a great deal," he added gravely. "As for the talc mask and the black moustache, that is not much to help us, it is true. He looked at Ricardo's crestfallen face and smiled. "We might arrest our good friend M. Ricardo upon that evidence, but no one else that I know." Hanaud laughed immoderately at his joke. He alone seemed to feel no disappointment at Perrichet's oversight. Ricardo was a little touchy on the subject of his personal appearance, and bridled visibly. Hanaud turned towards Servatas. "Now," he said, "you know how much petrol was taken from the garage?" "Yes, monsieur." "Can you tell me, by the amount which has been used, how far that car was driven last night?" Hanaud asked. Servatas examined the tank. "A long way, monsieur. From 130 to 150 kilometers, I should say." "Yes, just about that distance, I should say," cried Hanaud. His eyes brightened, and a smile, a rather fierce smile, came to his lips. He opened the door, and examined with a minute scrutiny the floor of the carriage, and as he looked, the smile faded from his face. Perplexity returned to it. He took the cushions, looked them over and shook them out. "I see no sign," he began, and then he uttered a little shrill cry of satisfaction. From the crack of the door by the hinge he picked off a tiny piece of pale green stuff, which he spread out upon the back of his hand. "Tell me, what is this?" he said to Ricardo. "It is a green fabric," said Ricardo very wisely. "It is green chiffon," said Hanaud. "And the frock in which Mlle Celia went away was of green chiffon over satin." "Yes, Mlle Celia travelled in this car." He hurried to the driver's seat. Upon the floor there was some dark mold. Hanaud cleaned it off with his knife and held some of it in the palm of his hand. He turned to Servatas. "You drove the car on Tuesday morning before you went to Chambéry?" "Yes, monsieur." "Where did you take up Madame Dovry and Mlle Celia?" "At the front door of the Villa Rose." "Did you get down from the seat at all?" "No, monsieur, not after I left the garage." Hanaud returned to his companions. "See." And he opened his hand. "This is black soil, moist from last night's rain, soil like the soil in front of Madame Dovry's salon. Look, here is even a blade or two of the grass," and he turned the mold over in the palm of his hand. Then he took an empty envelope from his pocket and poured the soil into it and gummed the flap down. He stood and frowned at the motorcar. "Listen," he said, "how I am puzzled. There was a man last night at the Villa Rose. There were a man's blurred footmarks in the mold before the glass door. That man drove Madame's car for 150 kilometers, and he leaves the mold which clung to his boots upon the floor of his seat. Mlle Celia and another woman drove away inside the car. Mlle Celia leaves a fragment of the chiffon tunic of her frock which caught in the hinge. But Mlle Celia made much clearer impressions in the mold than the man. Yet on the floor of the carriage there is no trace of her shoes. Again I say there is something here which I do not understand." And he spread out his hands with an impulsive gesture of despair. "It looks as if they had been careful and he careless," said Mr. Ricardo, with the air of a man solving a very difficult problem. "What a mind!" cried Hanaud, now clasping his hands together in admiration. "How quick and how profound!" There was at times something elephantinely elfish in M. Hanaud's demeanor, which left Mr. Ricardo at a loss. But he had come to notice that these undignified manifestations usually took place when Hanaud had reached a definite opinion upon some point which had perplexed him. "Yet there is perhaps another explanation," Hanaud continued. "For observe, M. Ricardo. We have other evidence to show that the careless one was Mlle Celia. It was she who left her footsteps so plainly visible upon the grass, not the man. However, we will go back to M. Wethermill's room at the Hotel Majestic and talk this matter over. We know something now." "Yes, we know. What do we know, monsieur?" he asked, suddenly turning with a smile to Ricardo, and, as Ricardo paused, "Think it over while we walk down to M. Wethermill's apartment in the Hotel Majestic." "We know that the murderer has escaped," replied Ricardo hotly. "The murderer is not now the most important object of our search. He is very likely at Marseille by now. We shall lay our hands on him, never fear, replied Hanaud, with a superb gesture of disdain. But it was thoughtful of you to remind me of him. I might so easily have clean forgotten him, and then indeed my reputation would have suffered an eclipse. He made a low, ironical bow to Ricardo and walked quickly down the road. For a cumbersome man he is extraordinarily active, said Mr. Ricardo to Harry Wethermill, trying to laugh, without much success. A heavy, clever, middle-aged man, liable to become a little gutter boy at a moment's notice. Thus he described the great detective, and the description is quoted. For it was Ricardo's best effort in the whole of this business. The three men went straight to Harry Wethermill's apartment, which consisted of a sitting room and a bedroom on the first floor. A balcony ran along outside. Hanaud stepped out onto it, looked about him, and returned. It is as well to know that we cannot be overheard, he said. Harry Wethermill meanwhile had thrown himself into a chair. The mask he had worn had slipped from its fastenings for a moment. There was a look of infinite suffering upon his face. It was the face of a man tortured by misery to the snapping point. Hanaud, on the other hand, was particularly alert. The discovery of the motor car had raised his spirits. He sat at the table. I will tell you what we have learnt, he said, and it is of importance. The three of them, the man, the woman with the red hair, and Mlle Celia, all drove yesterday night to Geneva. That is only one thing we have learnt. Then you still cling to Geneva? Said Ricardo. More than ever, said Hanaud. He turned in his chair towards Wethermill. Ah, my poor friend, he said, when he saw the young man's distress. Harry Wethermill sprang up with a gesture as though to sweep the need of sympathy away. What can I do for you? He asked. You have a road map, perhaps? Said Hanaud. Yes, said Wethermill, mine is here. There it is, and crossing the room he brought it from a side table and placed it in front of Hanaud. Hanaud took a pencil from his pocket. 150 kilometers was about the distance which the car had traveled. Measure the distances here and you will see that Geneva is the likely place. It is a good city to hide in. Moreover, the car appears at the corner at daylight. How does it appear, there? What road is it which comes out at that corner? The road from Geneva. I am not sorry that it is Geneva, for the chef de la Sûreté is a friend of mine. And what else do we know? Asked Ricardo. This, said Hanaud. He paused impressively. Bring up your chair to the table, M. Wethermill, and consider whether I am right or wrong, and he waited until Harry Wethermill had obeyed. Then he laughed in a friendly way at himself. I cannot help it, he said, I have an eye for dramatic effects. I must prepare for them when I know they are coming. And one, I tell you, is coming now. He shook his finger at his companions. Ricardo shifted and shuffled in his chair. Harry Wethermill kept his eyes fixed on Hanaud's face, but he was quiet, as he had been throughout the long inquiry. Hanaud lit a cigarette and took his time. What I think is this. The man who drove the car into Geneva drove it back, because he meant to leave it again in the garage of the Villa Rose. Good heavens! Cried Ricardo, flinging himself back. The theory so calmly enunciated took his breath away. Would he have dared? Asked Harry Wethermill. Hanaud leaned across and tapped his fingers on the table to emphasize his answer. All through this crime there are two things visible: brains and daring, clever brains and extraordinary daring. Would he have dared? He dared to be at the corner close to the Villa Rose at daylight. Why else should he have returned except to put back the car? Consider. The petrol is taken from tins which Servatas might never have touched for a fortnight, and by that time he might, as he said, have forgotten whether he had not used them himself. I had this possibility in my mind when I put the questions to Servatas about the petrol which the commissaire thought so stupid. The utmost care is taken that there shall be no mold left on the floor of the carriage. The scrap of chiffon was torn off, no doubt, when the women finally left the car, and therefore not noticed, or that, too, would have been removed. That the exterior of the car was dirty betrayed nothing, for Servatas had left it uncleaned. Hanaud leaned back and, step by step, related the journey of the car. The man leaves the gate open, he drives into Geneva the two women, who are careful that their shoes shall leave no marks upon the floor. At Geneva they get out. The man returns. If he can only leave the car in the garage, he covers all traces of the course he and his friends have taken. No one would suspect that the car had ever left the garage. At the corner of the road, just as he is turning down to the villa, he sees a Sergeant de Ville at the gate. He knows that the murder is discovered. He puts on full speed and goes straight out of the town. What is he to do? He is driving a car for which the police in an hour or two, if not now already, will be surely watching. He is driving it in broad daylight. He must get rid of it, and at once, before people are about to see it, and to see him in it. Imagine his feelings. It is almost enough to make one pity him. Here he is in a car which convicts him as a murderer, and he has nowhere to leave it. He drives through Aix. Then on the outskirts of the town he finds an empty villa. He drives in at the gate, forces the door of the coach house, and leaves his car there. Now, observe. It is no longer any use for him to pretend that he and his friends did not disappear in that car. The murder is already discovered, and with the murder the disappearance of the car. So he no longer troubles his head about it. He does not remove the traces of mold from the place where his feet rested, which otherwise, no doubt, he would have done. It no longer matters. He has to run to earth now before he is seen. That is all his business. And so the state of the car is explained. It was a bold step to bring that car back, yes, a bold and desperate step. But a clever one. For, if it had succeeded, we should have known nothing of their movements. Oh, but nothing, nothing. Ah. I tell you, this is no ordinary blundering affair. They are clever people who devised this crime, clever, and of an audacity which is surprising. Then Hanaud lit another cigarette. Mr. Ricardo, on the other hand, could hardly continue to smoke for excitement. "I cannot understand your calmness," he exclaimed. "No?" said Hanaud. "Yet it is so obvious. You are the amateur, I am the professional, that is all." He looked at his watch and rose to his feet. "I must go," he said, and as he turned towards the door a cry sprang from Mr. Ricardo's lips. "It is true. I am the amateur. Yet I have knowledge, Monsieur Hanaud, which the professional would do well to obtain." Hanaud turned a guarded face towards Ricardo. There was no longer any raillery in his manner. He spoke slowly, coldly. "Let me have it then." "I have driven in my motor car from Geneva to Aix," Ricardo cried it excitedly. "A bridge crosses a ravine high up amongst the mountains. At the bridge there is a custom house. There at the Pont de la Caille your car is stopped. It is searched. You must sign your name in a book. And there is no way round. You would find sure and certain proof whether or no Madame Dovery's car travelled last night to Geneva. Not so many travellers pass along that road at night. You would find certain proof too of how many people were in the car. For they search carefully at the Pont de la Caille." A dark flush overspread Hanaud's face. Ricardo was in the seventh heaven. He had at last contributed something to the history of this crime. He had repaired an omission. He had supplied knowledge to the omniscient. Wethermill looked up drearily like one who has lost heart. "Yes, you must not neglect that clue," he said. Hanaud replied testily. "It is not a clue. Ricardo tells that he travelled from Geneva into France and that his car was searched. Well, we know already that the officers are particular at the custom houses of France. But travelling from France into Switzerland is a very different affair. In Switzerland, hardly a glance, hardly a word." That was true. Ricardo, crestfallen, recognized the truth. But his spirits rose again at once. "But the car came back from Geneva into France," he cried. "Yes, but when the car came back, the man was alone in it," Hanaud answered. "I have more important things to attend to. For instance, I must know whether by any chance they have caught our man at Marseille." He laid his hand on Wethermill's shoulder. "And you, my friend, I should counsel you to get some sleep. We may need all our strength tomorrow." I hope so. He was speaking very bravely. Yes, I hope so. Wethermill nodded. I shall try, he said. That's better, said Hanaud cheerfully. You will both stay here this evening, for if I have news, I can then ring you up. Both men agreed, and Hanaud went away. He left Mr. Ricardo profoundly disturbed. That man will take advice from no one, he declared. His vanity is colossal. It is true they are not particular at the Swiss frontier. Still the car would have to stop there. At the custom house they would know something. Hanaud ought to make inquiries. But neither Ricardo nor Harry Wethermill heard a word more from Hanaud that night. Chapter 10 News from Geneva. The next morning, however, before Mr. Ricardo was out of his bed, Hanaud was announced. He came stepping gaily into the room, more elephantinely elfish than ever. Send your valet away, he said. And as soon as they were alone he produced a newspaper, which he flourished in Mr. Ricardo's face and then dropped into his hands. Ricardo saw staring him in the face a full description of Celia Harland, of her appearance and her dress, of everything except her name, coupled with an intimation that a reward of 4,000 francs would be paid to anyone who could give information leading to the discovery of her whereabouts to Mr. Ricardo, the Hotel Majestic, Aix-les-baines. Mr. Ricardo sat up in his bed with a sense of outrage. You have done this? He asked. Yes. Why have you done it? Mr. Ricardo cried. Hanaud advanced to the bed mysteriously on the tips of his toes. I will tell you, he said, in his most confidential tones. Only it must remain a secret between you and me. I did it because I have a sense of humor. I hate publicity, said Mr. Ricardo acidly. On the other hand, you have 4,000 francs, protested the detective. Besides, what else should I do? If I name myself, the very people we are seeking to catch, who you may be sure, will be the first to read this advertisement, will know that I, the great, the incomparable Hanaud, am after them, and I do not want them to know that. Besides, and he spoke now in a gentle and most serious voice, why should we make life more difficult for Mlle Celia by telling the world that the police want her? It will be time enough for that when she appears before the juge d'instruction. Mr. Ricardo grumbled inarticulately, and read through the advertisement again. Besides, your description is incomplete, he said. There is no mention of the diamond earrings which Celia Harland was wearing when she went away. Ah. So you noticed that? Exclaimed Hanaud. A little more experience and I should be looking very closely to my laurels. But as for the earrings, I will tell you, Mlle Celia was not wearing them when she went away from the Villa Rose. But, stammered Ricardo, the case upon the dressing-room table was empty. Still, she was not wearing them, I know, said Hanaud decisively. How do you know? Cried Ricardo, gazing at Hanaud with awe in his eyes. How could you know? Because, and Hanaud struck a majestic attitude, like a king in a play, because I am the captain of the ship. Upon that Mr. Ricardo suffered a return of his ill humor. I do not like to be trifled with, he remarked, with as much dignity as his ruffled hair and the bedclothes allowed him. He looked sternly at the newspaper, turning it over, and then he uttered a cry of surprise. But this is yesterday's paper, he said. Yesterday evening's paper, Hanaud corrected. Printed at Geneva. Printed, and published and sold at Geneva, said Hanaud. When did you send the advertisement in, then? I wrote a letter while we were taking our luncheon, Hanaud explained. The letter was to Bernard, asking him to telegraph the advertisement at once. But you never said a word about it to us, Ricardo grumbled. No. And was I not wise? Said Hanaud, with complacency. For you would have forbidden me to use your name. Oh, I don't go so far as that, said Ricardo reluctantly. His indignation was rapidly evaporating. For there was growing up in his mind a pleasant perception that the advertisement placed him in the limelight. He rose from his bed. You will make yourself comfortable in the sitting-room while I have my bath. I will, indeed, replied Hanaud cheerily. I have already ordered my morning chocolate. I have hopes that you may have a telegram very soon. This paper was cried last night through the streets of Geneva. Ricardo dressed for once in a way with some approach to ordinary celerity, and joined Hanaud. Has nothing come? He asked. No. This chocolate is very good, it is better than that which I get in my hotel. Good heavens! Cried Ricardo, who was fairly twittering with excitement. You sit there talking about chocolate while my cup shakes in my fingers. Again I must remind you that you are the amateur, I the professional, my friend. As the morning drew on, however, Hanaud's professional quietude deserted him. He began to start at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, to glance every other moment from the window, to eat his cigarettes rather than to smoke them. At 11 o'clock Ricardo's valet brought a telegram into the room. Ricardo seized it. Calmly, my friend, said Hanaud. With trembling fingers Ricardo tore it open. He jumped in his chair. Speechless, he handed the telegram to Hanaud. It had been sent from Geneva, and it ran thus. Expect me soon after 3. Mart Gobin. Hanaud nodded his head. I told you I had hopes. All his levity had gone in an instant from his manner. He spoke very quietly. I had better send for Wethermill? Asked Ricardo. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. As you like. But why raise hopes in that poor man's breast which an hour or two may dash for ever to the ground? Consider. Mart Gobin has something to tell us. Think over those 8 points of evidence which you drew up yesterday in the Villa des Fleurs, and say whether what she has to tell us is more likely to prove Mlle Celia's innocence than her guilt. Think well, for I will be guided by you, Ricardo, said Hanaud solemnly. If you think it better that your friend should live in torture until Mart Gobin comes, and then perhaps suffer worse torture from the news she brings, be it so. You shall decide. If, on the other hand, you think it will be best to leave Wethermill in peace until we know her story, be it so. You shall decide. Ricardo moved uneasily. The solemnity of Hanaud's manner impressed him. He had no wish to take the responsibility of the decision upon himself. But Hanaud sat with his eyes strangely fixed upon Ricardo, waiting for his answer. Well, said Ricardo, at length, good news will be none the worse for waiting a few hours. Bad news will be a little the better. Yes, said Hanaud, so I thought you would decide. He took up a Continental Bradshaw from a bookshelf in the room. From Geneva she will come through Culoz. Let us see. He turned over the pages. There is a train from Culoz which reaches Aix at 7 minutes past 3. It is by that train she will come. You have a motor car? Yes. Very well. Will you pick me up in it at 3 at my hotel? We will drive down to the station and see the arrivals by that train. It may help us to get some idea of the person with whom we have to deal. That is always an advantage. Now I will leave you, for I have much to do. But I will look in upon Wethermill as I go down and tell him that there is as yet no news. He took up his hat and stick, and stood for a moment staring out of the window. Then he roused himself from his reverie with a start. You look out upon Montrevard, I see. I think Wethermill's view over the garden and the town is the better one, he said, and went out of the room. At 3 o'clock Ricardo called in his car, which was an open car of high power, at Hanaud's hotel, and the two men went to the station. They waited outside the exit while the passengers gave up their tickets. Amongst them a middle-aged, short woman, of a plethoric tendency, attracted their notice. She was neatly but shabbily dressed in black, her gloves were darned, and she was obviously in a hurry. As she came out she asked a commissionaire, "How far is it to the Hotel Majestic?" The man told her the hotel was at the very top of the town, and the way was steep. "But Madame can go up in the omnibus of the hotel," he suggested. Madame, however, was in too much of a hurry. The omnibus would have to wait for luggage. She hailed a closed cab and drove off inside it. "Now, if we go back in the car, we shall be all ready for her when she arrives," said Hanaud. They passed the cab, indeed, a few yards up the steep hill which leads from the station. The cab was moving at a walk. She looks honest, said Hanaud, with a sigh of relief. She is some good bourgeoise anxious to earn 4,000 francs. They reached the hotel in a few minutes. We may need your car again the moment Mart Gobind has gone, said Hanaud. It shall wait here, said Ricardo. No, said Hanaud, let it wait in the little street at the back of my hotel. It will not be so noticeable there. You have petrol for a long journey? Ricardo gave the order quietly to his chauffeur, and followed Hanaud into the hotel. Through a glass window they could see Wethermill smoking a cigar over his coffee. He looks as if he had not slept, said Ricardo. Hanaud nodded sympathetically, and beckoned Ricardo past the window. But we are nearing the end. These 2 days have been for him days of great trouble, one can see that very clearly. And he has done nothing to embarrass us. Men in distress are apt to be a nuisance. I am grateful to M. Wethermill. But we are nearing the end. Who knows? Within an hour or two we may have news for him. He spoke with great feeling, and the 2 men ascended the stairs to Ricardo's rooms. For the second time that day Hanaud's professional calm deserted him. The window overlooked the main entrance to the hotel. Hanaud arranged the room, and, even while he arranged it, ran every other second and leaned from the window to watch for the coming of the cab. Put the banknotes upon the table, he said hurriedly. They will persuade her to tell us all that she has to tell. Yes, that will do. She is not in sight yet? No. She could not be. It is a long way from the station, said Ricardo, and the whole distance is uphill. Yes, that is true, Hanaud replied. We will not embarrass her by sitting round the table like a tribunal. You will sit in that armchair. Ricardo took his seat, crossed his knees, and joined the tips of his fingers. So. Not too judicial. Said Hanaud, I will sit here at the table. Whatever you do, do not frighten her. Hanaud sat down in the chair which he had placed for himself. Mart Gobind shall sit opposite, with the light upon her face. So. And, springing up, he arranged a chair for her. Whatever you do, do not frighten her, he repeated. I am nervous. So much depends upon this interview. And in a second he was back at the window. Ricardo did not move. He arranged in his mind the interrogatory which was to take place. He was to conduct it. He was the master of the situation. All the limelight was to be his. Startling facts would come to light elicited by his deft questions. Hanaud need not fear. He would not frighten her. He would be gentle, he would be cunning. Softly and delicately he would turn this good woman inside out, like a glove. Every artistic fiber in his body vibrated to the dramatic situation. Suddenly Hanaud leaned out of the window. It comes. It comes. He said in a quick, feverish whisper. I can see the cab between the shrubs of the drive. Let it come, said Mr. Ricardo superbly. Even as he sat he could hear the grating of wheels upon the drive. He saw Hanaud lean farther from the window and stamp impatiently upon the floor. There it is at the door, he said, and for a few seconds he spoke no more. He stood looking downwards, craning his head, with his back towards Ricardo. Then, with a wild and startled cry, he staggered back into the room. His face was white as wax, his eyes full of horror, his mouth open. What is the matter? Exclaimed Ricardo, springing to his feet. They are lifting her out. She doesn't move. They are lifting her out. For a moment he stared into Ricardo's face, paralyzed by fear. Then he sprang down the stairs. Ricardo followed him. There was confusion in the corridor. Men were running, voices were crying questions. As they passed the window they saw Wethermill start up, aroused from his lethargy. They knew the truth before they reached the entrance of the hotel. A cab had driven up to the door from the station. In the cab was an unknown woman stabbed to the heart. She should have come by the omnibus, Hanaud repeated and repeated stupidly. For the moment he was off his balance. Chapter 11 The Unopened Letter. The hall of the hotel had been cleared of people. At the entrance from the corridor a porter barred the way. No one can pass, said he. "I think that I can," said Hanaud, and he produced his card. From the Sûreté at Paris. He was allowed to enter, with Ricardo at his heels. On the ground lay Marthe Gobin, the manager of the hotel stood at her side, a doctor was on his knees. Hanaud gave his card to the manager. "You have sent word to the police?" "Yes," said the manager. "And the wound?" asked Hanaud, kneeling on the ground beside the doctor. It was a very small wound, round and neat and clean, and there was very little blood. "It was made by a bullet," said Hanaud, "some tiny bullet from an air pistol." "No," answered the doctor. "No knife made it," Hanaud asserted. "That is true," said the doctor. "Look." And he took up from the floor by his knee the weapon which had caused Marthe Gobin's death. It was nothing but an ordinary skewer with a ring at one end and a sharp point at the other, and a piece of common white firewood for a handle. The wood had been split, the ring inserted and spliced in position with strong twine. It was a rough enough weapon, but an effective one. The proof of its effectiveness lay stretched upon the floor beside them. Hanaud gave it to the manager of the hotel. "You must be very careful of this, and give it as it is to the police." Then he bent once more over Marthe Gobin. "Did she suffer?" he asked in a low voice. "No, death must have been instantaneous," said the doctor. "I am glad of that," said Hanaud, as he rose again to his feet. In the doorway the driver of the cab was standing. "What has he to say?" Hanaud asked. The man stepped forward instantly. He was an old, red-faced, stout man, with a shiny white tall hat, like 1,000 drivers of cabs. "What have I to say, monsieur?" he grumbled in a husky voice. "I take up the poor woman at the station and I drive her where she bids me, and I find her dead, and my day is lost. Who will pay my fare, monsieur?" "I will," said Hanaud. "There it is," and he handed the man a 5-franc piece. "Now, answer me. Do you tell me that this woman was murdered in your cab and that you knew nothing about it?" "But what should I know? I take her up at the station, and all the way up the hill her head is every moment out of the window, crying, 'Faster, faster!' Oh, the good woman was in a hurry. But for me I take no notice. The more she shouts, the less I hear. I bury my head between my shoulders, and I look ahead of me and I take no notice. One cannot expect cab horses to run up these hills, it is not reasonable." "So you went at a walk," said Hanaud. He beckoned to Ricardo, and said to the manager, Hanaud will, no doubt, be here in a few minutes, and he will send for the juge d'instruction. There is nothing that we can do." He went back to Ricardo's sitting room and flung himself into a chair. He had been calm enough downstairs in the presence of the doctor and the body of the victim. Now, with only Ricardo for a witness, he gave way to distress. "It is terrible," he said. "The poor woman. It was I who brought her to Aix. It was through my carelessness. But who would have thought?" He snatched his hands from his face and stood up. "I should have thought," he said solemnly. "Extraordinary daring, that was one of the qualities of my criminal. I knew it, and I disregarded it. Now we have a second crime." "The skewer may lead you to the criminal," said Mr. Ricardo. "The skewer!" cried Hanaud. "How will that help us? A knife, yes perhaps. But a skewer? At the shops there will not be so many in Aix at which you can buy skewers. They may remember to whom they sold one within the last day or so." "How do we know it was bought in the last day or so?" cried Hanaud scornfully. "We have not to do with a man who walks into a shop and buys a single skewer to commit a murder with, and so hands himself over to the police. How often must I say it?" The violence of his contempt nettled Ricardo. "If the murderer did not buy it, how did he obtain it?" he asked obstinately. "Oh, my friend, could he not have stolen it? From this or from any hotel in Aix? Would the loss of a skewer be noticed, do you think? How many people in Aix today have had rognons à la brochette for their luncheon? Besides, it is not merely the death of this poor woman which troubles me. We have lost the evidence which she was going to bring to us. She had something to tell us about Celia Harland which now we shall never hear. We have to begin all over again, and I tell you we have not the time to begin all over again. No, we have not the time. Time will be lost, and we have no time to lose. He buried his face again in his hands and groaned aloud. His grief was so violent and so sincere that Ricardo, shocked as he was by the murder of Mlle Celia, set himself to console him. But you could not have foreseen that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Aix. Hanaud brushed the excuse aside. It is no extenuation. I ought to have foreseen. Oh, but I will have no pity now, he cried, and as he ended the words abruptly his face changed. He lifted a trembling forefinger and pointed. There came a sudden look of life into his dull and despairing eyes. He was pointing to a side table on which were piled Mr. Ricardo's letters. You have not opened them this morning? He asked. No. You came while I was still in bed. I have not thought of them till now. Hanaud crossed to the table, and, looking down at the letters, uttered a cry. There's one, the big envelope, he said, his voice shaking like his hand. It has a Swiss stamp. He swallowed to moisten his throat. Ricardo sprang across the room and tore open the envelope. There was a long letter enclosed in a handwriting unknown to him. He read aloud the first lines of the letter. I write what I saw and post it tonight, so that no one may be before me with the news. I will come over tomorrow for the money. A low exclamation from Hanaud interrupted the words. The signature. Quick. Ricardo turned to the end of the letter. Mlle Celia. She speaks, then. After all she speaks. Hanaud whispered in a voice of awe. He ran to the door of the room, opened it suddenly, and, shutting it again, locked it. Quick. We cannot bring that poor woman back to life, but we may still. He did not finish his sentence. He took the letter unceremoniously from Ricardo's hand and seated himself at the table. Over his shoulder Mr. Ricardo, too, read Mlle Celia's letter. It was just the sort of letter, which in Ricardo's view, Mlle Celia would have written a long, straggling letter which never kept to the point, which exasperated them one moment by its folly and fired them to excitement the next. It was dated from a small suburb of Geneva, on the western side of the lake, and it ran as follows. The suburb is but a street close to the lake side, and a tram runs into the city. It is quite respectable, you understand, monsieur, with a hotel at the end of it, and really some very good houses. But I do not wish to deceive you about the social position of myself or my husband. Our house is on the wrong side of the street, definitely, yes. It is a small house, and we do not see the water from any of the windows because of the better houses opposite. M. Celia, my husband, who was a clerk in one of the great banks in Geneva, broke down in health in the spring, and for the last 3 months has been compelled to keep indoors. Of course, money has not been plentiful, and I could not afford a nurse. Consequently I myself have been compelled to nurse him. Monsieur, if you were a woman, you would know what men are when they are ill, how fretful, how difficult. There is not much distraction for the woman who nurses them. So, as I am in the house most of the day, I find what amusement I can in watching the doings of my neighbors. You will not blame me. A month ago the house almost directly opposite to us was taken furnished for the summer by a Madame Rossignol. She is a widow, but during the last fortnight a young gentleman has come several times in the afternoon to see her, and it is said in the street that he is going to marry her. But I cannot believe it myself. Monsieur is a young man of perhaps 30, with smooth, black hair. He wears a moustache, a little black moustache, and is altogether captivating. Madame Rossignol is 5 or 6 years older, I should think a tall woman, with red hair and a bold sort of coarse beauty. I was not attracted by her. She seemed not quite of the same world as that charming monsieur who was said to be going to marry her. No, I was not attracted by Adèle Rossignol. And when he had come to that point Hanaud looked up with a start. So the name was Adèle, he whispered. Yes, said Ricardo. Helene Vauquier spoke the truth. Hanaud nodded with a queer smile upon his lips. Yes, there she spoke the truth. I thought she did. But she said Adèle's hair was black, interposed Mr. Ricardo. Yes, There she didn't, said Hanaud dryly, and his eyes dropped again to the paper. I knew her name was Adele, for often I have heard her servant calling her so, and without any madam in front of the name. That is strange, is it not, to hear an elderly servant woman calling after her mistress, Adele, just simple Adele? It was that which made me think Monsieur and Madame were not of the same world. But I do not believe that they are going to be married. I have an instinct about it. Of course, one never knows with what extraordinary women the nicest men will fall in love. So that after all these two may get married. But if they do, I do not think they will be happy. Besides the old woman there was another servant, a man, Hippolyte, who served in the house and drove the carriage when it was wanted, a respectable man. He always touched his hat when Madame Rossignol came out of the house. He slept in the house at night, although the stable was at the end of the street. I thought he was probably the son of Jeanne, the servant woman. He was young, and his hair was plastered down upon his forehead, and he was altogether satisfied with himself and a great favorite amongst the servants in the street. The carriage and the horse were hired from Geneva. That is the household of Madame Rossignol. So far, Mr. Ricardo read in silence. Then he broke out again. But we have them. The red-haired woman called Adele, the man with the little black moustache. It was he who drove the motor car. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.